We're going to start off talking about the Philippine War. The rebels in the Philippines had a particular tactic of using protracted guerrilla warfare up until the next U.S. election in 1900. The reason for this strategy was that the rebels in the Philippines had this theory that if they just kept up guerrilla warfare up until the U.S. election in 1900, eventually the citizens of America would be tired of going to war with the Philippines and they would elect a new president who did not want to get involved with the Philippines. However, this plan did not work out for the Filipino rebels because the pro war President McKinley was reelected in 1900 and the U.S. kept up with their war aims in the Philippines. Now, while in the Philippines, when President McKinley was reelected, he had a particular strategy for counterinsurgency against the rebels, typically consisting of will, force, and conciliation. So the force part was due to aggressive patrolling, even destructive raids. The raids were very barbaric and brutal. They would burn down villages and crops, things that are illegal today, they would do back then. But not so legal was the fact that they were also torturing. It was really brutal, these raids that they did. That was for force. As for the conciliation part, they balanced all that force and aggression with also putting forth good civil affairs. So they had really positive aid and infrastructure programs, a lot of medical support and infrastructure support that they put into the Philippines, into making the Philippines a better place. So the key takeaway here is that the strategy that McKinley had, who was pro-war, he was the pro-war president, reelected in 1900, it focused on force, doing aggressive patrolling and raids, but it also balanced that with conciliation, meaning good civil affairs, a lot of aid, infrastructure repairs, medical support, logistical support for the people in the Philippines. So they did both, right? Two sides of a coin. So check on learning. Was the U.S. Army well prepared for the Spanish-American War? No, it wasn't. How well did its South Cuba logistical operations, staff work, and disease control go? It went terrible. That was from the previous PowerPoint. They're just reviewing it again. In the Philippines, did the U.S. Navy secure Manila Bay quickly? Again, previous PowerPoint. Yes, they did secure Manila Bay very quickly right off the bat. First thing. Did the U.S. Army then work well with Filipino rebels to take Manila? So the U.S. Army took a little while to get there. Once they did, it was pretty easy to take Manila Bay. Did Manila's conquest require a hard fight? No, it was a very easy fight. It was a staged fight, right, between Spain and U.S., and Spain agreed that they would throw the fight, but they would put forth like kind of a fight that looked real but wasn't really real. And, of course, the U.S. won. When the U.S. won, they drew up a treaty with Spain. Spain gave the Philippines to the U.S., and the U.S. now conquered Manila Bay. So it was a very easy fight for them. And they eventually worked with the Filipino rebels, and everybody was satisfied at that point. Now for this new stuff, for this new PowerPoint, regarding the U.S. elections, what was the Filipino rebel strategy? The Filipino rebel strategy was protracted guerrilla warfare. So guerrilla warfare stretched out to last all the way until 1900s, and up until 1900. Because in 1900 there was going to be a re-election, and the Filipino rebels thought that if they did protracted guerrilla warfare up until the presidential re-election, then the American citizens would want to elect a president that was anti-war and didn't want to go to war with Filipino, and then the Filipino rebels would get to keep their independence. But the strategy didn't work, right? The strategy did not work because President McKinley was pro-war, and he was re-elected in 1900. So the plan from the Filipino rebels did not work. To win the Philippine War, the U.S. did balance aggressive, destructive patrols with aid programs, and that improved Filipino infrastructure. So while they were burning villages and doing raids, at the same time they were also offering aid programs, which improved Filipino infrastructure. So they kind of worked well with the Filipinos, even though they were doing some pretty brutal war tactics. They did both, right? Both sides of the coin. So that's what's important to know for the test question. Next, for China, the 1900 Boxer Rebellion. They put one U.S. Army regiment there for a couple decades, all the way up until the late 1930s, because there was a lot of rebellion going on in China, and the U.S. wanted to protect their interests, so they sent a single army regiment to stay there for a couple decades to try to keep things under control to protect United States interests. Cuba, on the other hand, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had a breakthrough in Cuba against tropical diseases. They traced yellow fever to mosquitoes and realized that mosquitoes were responsible for yellow fever, and that allowed them to do a lot of really helpful measures to reduce disease prevalence in that tropical area right there at the equator in Cuba, and also in South America, at the northern tip of South America. And then because they did all this really beneficial work with disease control, that allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to build the Panama Canal. Before the Army Medical Corps did all this disease prevention and control, it was impractical, if not impossible, for the Army Corps of Engineers to go down there and build the Panama Canal. It was impossible because disease was so prevalent and it wasn't a good place to be. But then the Army Medical Corps did a lot of really good work with yellow fever, tracing it to mosquitoes and having prevention to protect people from those diseases, and that then allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to get in there and build the Panama Canal. Okay, so here's an example of Army Corps of Engineers and also the Army Medical Corps working together to get a single goal accomplished. Next thing to know about the Mexican Revolution. This was a very brief involvement. It was within 1 year it was over. Pershing was a commander. He sent in a relatively small expedition into Mexico to capture Villa. There was this Mexican Revolution. It started spilling into the United States. Civilians of the United States were in danger, and so they felt obligated to get involved. So Pershing sent a small expedition into Mexico. They weren't able to capture Villa, but they did suppress some of the mischief of the rebels in Mexico, but they didn't want to stay long because they feared that if they stayed in Mexico too long, it would have led to a full-out war between Mexico and U.S., so they had limited operational aims and limited duration, and then they were out of Mexico within a year. So very short, brief expedition here. But what is so significant about this Mexican Revolution that the U.S. got involved in, at this time, in 1917, they finally had planes, and the Army used a new war tech they've never used before. They used planes. This was kind of, since it was such an unimportant kind of expedition, they decided to test planes out here and see how they fared in warfare for the first time in U.S. history, and they fared terribly. It was awful. In 1917, planes were crap, and furthermore, they had no experience using them in military up until this point, so it didn't really work out too well. But it was a good laboratory, a good test experiment time, because this wasn't a very important expedition, right? So this was a good time to test out planes, and it did not work very well. So we have a long way to go in terms of learning how to use planes for warfare. That's what we learned from this Mexican Revolution involvement that we got involved with. Next, you need to know about Eli Root. He's a really important figure in this lesson. He was the Secretary of War, and if you remember, there was a man named Upton and a man named Logan. Upton and Logan had different ideas on how to deal with the Army. Upton had a strong desire for a huge regular army, huge big army command, and he wanted to have a huge emphasis on West Point, and he thought that West Point was amazing, and we should have a lot of West Point graduates in the Army, and we should have a huge regular army. Whereas Logan was on the opposite end of the spectrum. Logan was more like George Washington. He had a desire for militia reform, and Logan was all about the militia, and he wanted to help reform the militia and make militias better, like the National Guard and the Reserve. He wanted to make militias better, get more funding for them, have better training for them, and he wanted to make the militia basically the backbone. So Eli Root comes along as Secretary of War, and he finds a way to satisfy both of them. And he comes up with a way to satisfy Upton's desire for a big regular army command with West Point graduates, and also satisfying Logan's desire for militia reform. And this is kind of how we see the beginning of the National Guard getting developing and getting to be a really significant part of U.S. military. So, the fourth bullet, what you need to know for the test, the takeaway is that Root embraced both Upton and Logan's approaches to Army improvement, and also he would start both militia reform and Army command reform. So Eli Root comes along and satisfies both Upton and Logan by pushing for better regular Army command and West Point graduates being pumped out at a faster rate, and also he satisfied Logan's desire for reforming the militia and making the militia better. So he did both, which is why Eli Root is so important, and he's known as being a very good Secretary of War. Then, in the early 1900s, there were some congressional acts. The National Guard, we talked about what Eli Root did for the militia. This is part of it. The National Guard helped to secure greater federal support for the militia, and in return, they allowed themselves to be under more federal control and more federal training. So they got more money from the federal government, and in exchange, the federal government was going to train them more and more thoroughly, and the federal government would also control them better and regulate them better. And that was part of the early 1900s congressional acts. So, for a review for the test questions, regarding Upton and Logan from Lesson 4, did Secretary of War Eli Root favor either one or both men's ideas in his reforms? So he favored both men's ideas in his reforms. Then, did Root's reforms include the militia and regular Army command? Yes, right? Eli Root's reforms included both the militia and regular Army command. Next, in the early 1900s congressional acts, did National Guard advocates gain greater federal support for the militia? Yes, they did. National Guard advocates gained greater federal support for the militia in return for more federal control and training of the militia. Then, did both the Army Corps of Engineers and Medical Corps play key roles in the Panama Canal's construction? Yes. In what ways? The Medical Corps of the Army traced yellow fever to mosquitoes and found good ways to prevent the transmission of yellow fever and other diseases, and that allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to have a more practical project for building Panama Canal, because before that it was a really impractical mission and a goal because diseases were such a bad problem. But the Medical Corps found ways to assist the Army Corps of Engineers in being more resistant and making it less likely that they would get yellow fever and other diseases and die, which is why the Army Corps of Engineers was then able to build the Panama Canal, right? Then were the Army deployments to Mexico and China both long-term? So the Army deployment to China was long-term. It lasted a couple decades. The Army deployment to Mexico, however, was not long-term at all. It was over within a year. And the deployment to Mexico and China were both small-scale. Both were small-scale. Both were a small amount of men that went into Mexico and China. Did new weapons like warplanes fare well in both? No. When they used warplanes in Mexico, they did not fare well. Well, that's okay because it wasn't really an important battle or conflict, and so this was a good chance for them to test out warplanes and see how they would fare and get experience. And the warplanes did not do well. But it's okay. We have plenty of time to work on them and improve them before we get into some more serious wars. Alright, so now we're moving on to World War I, and one word you should be familiar with is Hoocher. It's a German word that talks about their infantry tactics that use trench networks, and this was a really big problem for the U.S. during World War I. Germany had this really advanced infantry tactic. It's significant because it's the first substantial change to conventional infantry tactics that we see in this course. So this basically means that this tactic is similar to tactics that are used today. And it's something that the Germans used, and it was really deadly, really hard to overcome, especially for the U.S., because the U.S. didn't have enough experience and enough time to practice these kind of tactics and how to fight against these kind of tactics. So it was kind of a hard challenge that the U.S. had to face, was fighting against the Hoocher tactics, these infantry tactics with trench networks that made the German infantry a very formidable foe. As it says here, there's a lot of experience and training required to master this type of tactic. and that's going to be a big problem that we see later on in World War One that we're going to talk about. So we move on. This led to a managerial revolution, right? World War One, there was a lot of demands placed on the United States and her allies, and that led to a whole change in how the U.S. Army is managed. There was a new home front agency and a new general staff that had to make major changes to facilitate the supply. They came up with a numbering system that we still use today. That's why regiments and battalions are numbered. It's because of this managerial revolution that they started here. There was a streamlined command relationship at general staff level and in France. So just know that this managerial revolution is affecting the way missions in France are being conducted. And that led to what's called the Square Division, customized for Western Front combat. Now, Square Division is important. It means there's 4 sides to a square, right? And Square Division means that there's 4 regiments with 4 battalions, with 4 companies, each with 4 platoons. And so you see 4 levels of each tier in the Army. And this is massive, right? This is bigger than any divisions they've had before. And because it was so big, they had to sacrifice maneuvering opportunities in exchange for mass and depth to get more staying power for prolonged combat. So the Hutier infantry tactic, where they have trench networks that are really hard to break through, the US's, they didn't have time to train their soldiers to learn those kind of advanced tactics. So what they did instead was they used the Square Division, where they had huge amounts of men in 4 regiments with 4 battalions, 4 companies, 4 platoons, and each one just huge units of men out there fighting for a big slugging match, basically. Because these tactics are so hard to overcome, they instead wanted to get a really big club, right? They wanted to get a big club, basically, and use the principle of mass and depth to just make massive numbers of men to go against these Germans that have these really advanced, sophisticated battle tactics, like the Hutier tactics. But when you have so many men, you have great mass. You're massing all your power in one location. You have really strong manpower. But the downside of that is that it's hard to maneuver so many people, and it's hard to deploy so many people, right? Transportation and logistics becomes difficult when you have so many people. So you kind of have to sacrifice some maneuverability, some deployability, some logistical ease in exchange for using the principle of mass in order to have staying power for prolonged combat. So the bigger your units are, the longer they can stay on the battlefield and fight the Germans with these really sophisticated tactics that the Germans are using. And that's what's so significant about the Square Division that's customized for Western Front combat. Because at the Western Front, maneuvering was kind of a problem. It was hard to maneuver. The Western Front terrain was really hard to move through. It was muddy. It had dense forests where they were fighting. And so because maneuverability was difficult and they had such a hard time fighting against these advanced German tactics, they had to adapt by having square divisions, just huge units of people to be able to stay on the battlefield for a long time and be able to try to at least wear the Germans out with their advanced tactics that they were using. That's the Square Division. Alright, so this basically just straightforward. There was no time to learn tactics like the Hutier tactics. So the whole reason behind the Square Division and using the principle of mass, having these huge divisions to be on the Western Front, was because there was no time to teach the U.S. the advanced tactics like the Hutier tactics. So they had to adapt in different ways by just having these huge square divisions. As for the regular guard and volunteer draftee divisions deployed, it's important to know that when the Army got ready to fight in France during World War I, the National Guard was among the first people to respond, and the Guard sent entire divisions to France, like the 28th and the 42nd, and it tells you in the book that those divisions were among the first to arrive in France. So the National Guard was deployed in World War I, and not only were they deployed, but they were among the first to arrive in France in World War One. Then for Saint Mihiel, for the Battle of Saint Mihiel, know that it was a success for the United States, but it showed them what they had to work on, right? It showed them what they had to worry about, because it was a difficult victory for the U.S. That's typically because of combined arms problems, so logistical problems basically, and most divisions that had to go on to the next battle were still inexperienced. They still didn't have enough time to gain the experience they needed fighting in these massive battles that the U.S. wasn't used to fighting in, because World War I was a huge catastrophe, and the U.S. wasn't really used to fighting things like that. It had been a while since they had to fight so vigorously, and so it led to them having severe inexperience issues with their army. And this battle at Saint Mihiel was a tough success for them to get, but it was so tough it showed them kind of what was important, what they had to work on if they wanted to be successful in World War I. So know about Saint Mihiel, know that it led to many combined arms problems, there were logistical problems, and then when they went to the next battle was Meuse-Argonne. Now, at Meuse-Argonne, the Germans had a lot better determination. They weren't going to retreat this time. Also, there was a tough trench network of defenses, along with adverse terrain. So the Germans were using their Hutier tactics with all their really difficult trench networks and their really advanced infantry tactics, along with all that really hard terrain to maneuver around for the U.S., and that put a lot of stress on the combined arms coordination and offensive operations. It was a logistical nightmare, right? Combined arms didn't know how to deal with this type of terrain and this level of combat. Due to all that inexperience, there was a lot of failures for the United States, and the United States was not able to use any advanced infantry tactics here because they didn't have the experience or the time to prepare for any kind of advanced infantry tactics. So Meuse-Argonne was unfortunate. It was kind of bad for the U.S. due to the tough trench network defenses and the adverse terrain in the area, and the Germans put a lot of stress on the United States in this battle. We can look here at what's most important to focus on here. So tough German defenses, multiple elaborate trench networks, the Argonne Forest, wooded, hilly terrain, complicated matters. Know that what's also testable is that these divisions would be forced to make de facto penetrations, which placed heavy pressure on quick, fluid, combined arms operations. Basically what we just talked about. Alright? So now the difference between Saint Mihiel's and Meuse-Argonne. Saint Mihiel's was a victory for the U.S., although it was a hard victory. It put some stress on their combined arms. And then for the next battle at Meuse-Argonne, it was a lot more adverse terrain. The Germans were a lot tougher. They were not willing to retreat this time. They didn't want another loss. So tough terrain, tough trench networks, tough tactics, that really advanced, sophisticated infantry tactics that the Germans were using, like the Hutier tactics, and that really made it a very difficult battle for the United States, and it showed just how inexperienced the United States soldiers were, and there were a lot of failures during this battle for the U.S. because they didn't have any use of advanced infantry tactics to fight the Germans with. But nevertheless, we go on here, and one important thing to know is that during this time, the National Guard was the largest component all the way up through the 1939. So not through the 1930s, all the way through 1939, the National Guard was the largest component in the Army. Also, Army education was strong. Command and General Staff School and branch schools, the Army had a really strong education system for educating officers. Then, important to note, border and colonial defense priorities. The high budget priority Army branches were the Coast Artillery and the Air Corps, but no Coast Artillery in particular. So at this time, up until World War II, through the 1930s and 1920s. The Army was spending most of its money investing in placing artillery on the coast to help defend the nation. And a lot of the money wasn't going to airborne and armory. So they weren't investing much money in developing new types of armor. They weren't investing a lot of money into developing new types of armor. They weren't investing a lot of money into developing new types of weapons or to developing their airborne units. Instead, they were spending all their money on coast artillery to defend the coast. Alright, and that's through the 1920s and 1930s that's happening. Then, other promising warfighting technologies and styles comes out. Airborne and armor, right? Like I said, though, airborne and armor development, technology development, they didn't get much money or attention because all the money and attention was being spent on the Air Corps and, most importantly, coast artillery to defend the coast. But that all changes in World War II. Once World War II happens, then the Army's going to start spending more money developing their airborne tactics and on developing better armor and better war technology. But that's to come. We'll see that in a minute. Alright, so World War II, tensions are escalating, shit's going down in Europe, it's getting pretty bad, and so President Roosevelt kind of sees the writing on the wall, and he wants to get the United States prepared as best as he possibly could. So first thing he does right off the bat is he activates the National Guard. And he even talks to the government, and he has their deployment lengthened by an extra 6 months. They serve for a year, which is what they typically serve for, but then he realized that he's going to need them to be activated for longer, so then he keeps them activated for an extra 6 months, all the way to the start of U.S. involvement in World War II. So basically what's important to know here is that right off the bat, President Roosevelt activated the Guard, and then he even went through special measures to make sure that the Guard had to stay extra longer. They stayed an extra 6 months being activated because Roosevelt wanted to make sure that the Guard was activated all the way up until the U.S. finally got involved in World War II. Initially, the plan for the war was to focus on Germany, right? Germany was the biggest threat, so initially their war plan made Germany the priority because they figured Germany was the bigger threat, so they figured even if they did have to go to war in the Pacific Theater and fight against Japan and fight in Asia, they would still prioritize Germany because they figured Germany was the biggest threat. However, things with Japan got worse than they had expected, and so that plan kind of changed. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's do this review right now. So did National Guard units fight in France in World War I? Yes, they were among some of the first people to arrive in France, actually. The National Guard was, in fact, the largest part of the Army in the 1920s and 1930s. All right? President Roosevelt activated the Guard prior to our entry in World War II. Yes, he did. And he was able to keep the Guard activated all the way up until the time that the U.S. entered the war. Okay? And that required him to do some work to extend their activation for a longer period of time than they initially had to. Next, as for new organizations, when World War II happens, the Armored Force, parachute test units start getting the attention and the funding that they were denied earlier. And they come up with something called the Triangle Divisions. So we talked earlier about the Square Division, where you have 4 regiments, 4 battalions, 4 companies, 4 platoons, all of that. Well, now we have the Triangle Division, which is the same concept, but it's in threes. So you get 3 regiments, 3 companies, 3 platoons for everything. So it's a little bit smaller units, smaller manpower, but the benefit here is that it makes them more flexible, they're more easily deployed, and they can maneuver better in a global war. So they can be moved where they need to be more easily and more quickly because it's not as many people, it's not as large. And so even though it's a little bit smaller of a division, there's still the benefit here is that they have more flexibility. They can be deployed faster, they can be deployed more easily, and That was what's significant to know about the Triangle Division. Okay? And the armored force, like the parachute test units. These are new organizations that are being developed in the early 1940s. Alright? Whenever shit starts going down with the U.S. getting involved in World War II. Alright? Great. Next. Did World War I's logistics and command demands produce a managerial revolution in the U.S. Army? Yes, it did. Did post-World War I officer education support or undermine those advances? So it supported the advances, right? Next, did the World War I Square Division emphasize quick maneuver or massed blows in depth? The Square Division emphasizes massed blows in depth, right? Because it's a huge division, quick maneuver isn't really practical. You can't maneuver quickly. However, you can deliver massive blows in depth. Alright, you can keep your people on the battlefield longer with these huge units, and you can also hurt the Germans more and wear them down more with these huge square divisions. And then what did the World War II Triangle Division emphasize? Remember, the Triangle Division is smaller. It's in 3s instead of 4s, and so the Triangle Division's emphasis is deployability, being deployed easily, and also quick maneuvering. Okay? So the opposite emphasis of the Square Division. And it was smaller than the Square Division, obviously, okay? That's what's important to know for this review here. Next, was the U.S. Army prepared and trained well enough to do Hootcher-style tactics in World War I? No, it was not. Did it have problems with combined armed operations through Meuse-Argonne fighting? Absolutely, it sure did. Meuse-Argonne was terrible, and it was really challenging for combined arms operations for the United States. Did trench networks and terrain pose problems at Meuse-Argonne? Yes, it did. That was what was so hard about Meuse-Argonne. They had vast trench networks they had to fight through, and the terrain was very adverse, something that the U.S. wasn't, the inexperienced soldiers in the U.S. Army at this point in time were not really used to fighting in. In the 1930s, did the U.S. Army pay more attention to coast artillery? Yes, they did. Coast artillery was what was getting the most attention in the 1930s from the U.S. Army. They did not pay any attention to new tech-related functions like airborne or armor development. That came later in the 40s, once the U.S. got involved in World War II. Alright, so I mentioned briefly earlier about how Japan's early victories upset the Germany First strategic priority. Army divisions in Europe would not exceed those in the Pacific until late 1943. So even though originally they decided that Germany would be the priority, Japan was doing so well in the war that the Army had to send the majority of divisions to the Pacific theater because Japan was doing really well. So that kind of disrupted the Germany First priority. However, Europe and the fight against Germany was still receiving the most effort and attention. So they sent a lot of divisions in the Pacific, although Europe still retained greater priority because commanders, politicians were spending more attention on what was going on in Europe, and they were giving them more support logistically, more logistical support, keeping open more lines of communication with Europe. But it was unfortunately more of a obligation for them to have to send more divisions into the Pacific because Japan was doing so well. Then, for the United States Victory Plan, they estimated they would need 215 divisions. However, by mid-war, they decided to deal with 90 divisions. That's a huge difference, obviously, right? Less than half of their original estimation. And the reason for this was because of war production needs. At this time, the U.S. was producing most of the arms, ammunition, and supplies for their allies and for all the allies fighting in World War I. And if you send all of your men out into the divisions to fight, then you have less people in the factories producing all the ammunition, all the guns, all the supplies that are needed. And so you kind of have to balance between people that you're sending off to fight and people that you're keeping in the industrial front, making all the supplies and all the arms. And so that was the reason, because of war production needs, right? You can't just send everybody out to fight. You need some people at home producing supplies for everybody, particularly for the United States, because the United States, it was known as arsenal of democracy. The United States was producing all of the arsenal basically for all of the allies fighting in World War One, and so that required a lot of manpower in the industries to be producing these things. All right, and that's the reason why you go from a 215 division to a 90 division decision, because of the war production needs and the need for people to be at home producing things in the industry that are needed for war. All right. Next, we have the Anglo-American debate, which was actually more of a compromise about the timing of invasion of France. So the U.S. wanted to use the principle of mass. They wanted right away to send all their people into France, a bunch of regiments into France, and just overwhelm the Germans based off of mass alone, and just put all their soldiers, because the longer they wait, the more their regiments are going to be reduced in size because of all the soldiers dying. So they want to right off the bat go into France, use the principle of mass, and overwhelm the Germans based off the principle of mass. However, Britain had a different idea. They wanted to wait it out a little while to get more supplies and accumulate more supplies. They also wanted to focus on more peripheral theaters, typically like in the Mediterranean, and they wanted to wear down Germany slowly before they invaded France. They figured if they wore Germany down in peripheral theaters like in the Mediterranean, then it would be easier than to take France, because then Germany would have to send more people from France now to refill the Mediterranean, and that would kind of thin out the occupation of France. So Britain and U.S. started off disagreeing on their strategy for reclaiming Europe. So what they did was they compromised. The U.S. decided they would help Britain in the Mediterranean fighting the U-boats, and they would help Britain to wear the Germans down subtly and slowly, but Britain had to compromise by invading France a lot sooner than they wanted to. So they both kind of got what they wanted. The U.S. helped Britain with peripheral theaters and wearing Germans down in less important theaters, but Britain still invaded France much earlier than they had originally wanted to. So this was a compromise of strategies that they used. Alright, next we use a more complicated strategy in the Pacific Theater. It was an opportunistic two-axis advance via island hopping. There were other theaters nearby that were important, like China, but that had to become secondary. The reason it became secondary of a priority was because the Chinese army was doing terribly during World War II. And if the U.S. Army would have started off in China, they would have received little or no help from the Chinese Army, because the Chinese Army was just doing so terribly at this time that the U.S. Army would basically be fighting on their own. And so the U.S. Army would have started off with this really big fight that was really a lot for them to handle, and they wouldn't have gotten very far because they wouldn't have had much help from the Chinese, because the Chinese Army was moving from west to east towards the coast, closer towards Japan, and if the U.S. Army would have landed there at the coast, they would have had to wait for a while for the Chinese Army to meet them. Like, maybe it could have been years for all they knew, because the Chinese Army was moving so slowly because they were doing terribly in the war. And so for all they knew, if the U.S. Army would have started off in China, they would have been doing everything by themselves, and that would have been they would have bit off way more than they could chew, and they would have gotten nothing done, and they would have sacrificed a lot, basically getting nothing done. So instead they decided to do this two-axis advance, doing island hopping all along the islands in the South Pacific, all the way up to the Philippines, and getting closer and closer to the coast of China. And so this brings us to the principles of war that they used. So there's debate on eventually the two axes. There were two commanders, right, each going along different islands, but they had to meet at some point eventually close to the coast of China. And they had a debate on where they should meet. They decided, should we go all the way to the Philippines and then take the Philippines, or should we meet in China and take China? Well, they decided to meet the two-pronged axis movement in the Philippines, because taking the Philippines was a pretty practical idea, and it would be a huge victory, and it wouldn't be a very difficult victory. But if they would have skipped the Philippines and gone right to China, they might not have gotten anything done, because China was doing terribly. The Chinese army was doing terribly, and they would get pretty much no help from China, and so they would have skipped an easy victory for a really hard, overly ambitious plan that wouldn't really get much done, even if they were successful. So instead, they decided to meet at the Philippines and take the Philippines before they started doing stuff in China. And why is this smart? So it uses the principle of economy of force, maneuver, and mass. The U.S. applied minimum essential combat power in China because they knew it wouldn't get them very far, and that allowed them to use better maneuvering and decisive combat power in important islands at important times as they were moving closer to the Philippines and closer to the coast of China. So basically, they weren't going to waste all their effort and money and time doing stuff in China where they wouldn't get anywhere. Instead, they decided to instead invest in putting supplies, putting people on all these key islands, and then moving one by one like stepping stones, doing all these smaller, easier battles all the way up to the Philippines. Kind of like whenever Major Scallon said, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. China was like trying to go after the elephant all at once and swallow an elephant whole, whereas if they could take all these islands one by one and moving up, they could essentially cut the elephant into pieces and eat the pieces one by one, and they could actually get somewhere. Whereas if they went to China, they'd try to like take a bite out of the elephant when it's still alive, and the elephant would have trampled them, and they would have gotten nothing done, basically. So this is why they use wisely the economy of force, right? Economy, because think of it as like money. You don't want to invest your money going into China where you're gonna have to spend all your money and get nothing done. But you can use minimal amount of money. It'd be a lot cheaper if you invested instead of taking one small island after another, and that would make you have a lot of progress, and you could take all these small bites at a time and get a lot more done and be a lot more successful and get a lot further. And so that's how they use the economy of force and maneuver and mass. They didn't mass all the people in China. They instead used small amounts of people in small islands in multiple different places at once, doing a two-axis, two-pronged attack, two different commanders going along two different rails, basically, through different islands. And so they could spread their men out better instead of massing them all in one spot like they'd have to do in China. They spread their men out on different islands so they could take all these small bites at one time. So that's using the principle of mass, right? And then they're maneuvering better because they're island hopping. So doing one small battle after another allows them to move pretty quickly along these islands and basically cover more territory overall because you're island hopping. And then the economy of force, right? Like the money analogy, you're not spending all of your money in China where you're going to deplete all your resources and get nothing done. Instead, you're spending a little bit of money investing in one small island after another, and overall, by the end of it, you're getting even more done by the end of that. That's how you're using economy of force, by applying minimal essential combat power where it's needed. Okay. Now for the final review for this lesson. When the war started for the U.S., which theater had top priority? So the European theater had top priority. Germany was the top priority because they figured Germany was a bigger threat. Did that theater actually get the most support early in the war? So early in the war, most regiments were actually sent to the Pacific Theater, which was not their original plan, but it was because Japan was doing so well that it became an obligation to send more regiments to the Pacific. And it wasn't until late in the war that more regiments were in Europe. However, the Germany priority, it still gained more attention from commanders. It was still what they were more concerned about, and it led to them giving more support to the European efforts, even though most of the regiments were in the Pacific. Next, did U.S. leaders want to invade France sooner or later? U.S. leaders wanted to invade France sooner, as soon as possible. because they wanted to use the principle of mass, right? They wanted to mass as many soldiers in France as possible. The longer they waited, the more battles they fought before going into France, the smaller their regiments would be because they would have lost more soldiers. And so the U.S. didn't want to waste any time. They wanted to use the principle of mass against the Germans and just flood France with as many U.S. soldiers as possible early on. But the British wanted to do something a little bit differently. They wanted to wait, spend more time accumulating resources, accumulating items, materials that they needed. They also wanted to wear the Germans down by fighting in less important theaters like in the Mediterranean, fighting the U-boats, and having Germany divert their resources and lines of communication and manpower and support to refilling the Mediterranean. So the British kind of wanted to tiptoe around it and just gradually wear the Germans down before they invaded France. Because they figured if they wore the Germans down, then it'd be easier to take France. And they needed more time to accumulate resources. But they ended up compromising, and the U.S. helped the British for a little while fight in the Mediterranean, fight the U-boats. But then the part of the compromise was that U.S. and Great Britain ended up going into France much earlier than Britain had originally desired. Next, General Marshall reduced the Army's combat divisions from 215 to 90. Why was this? Because you had to balance home front production needs in the industries to producing the arms and ammunition and supplies you need. You have to balance that need with combat needs. If you send everybody from the U.S. that can fight out into the battlefield, then you have nobody on the home front producing all the arsenal, all the arms, all the ammunition and supplies that you need. So you have to balance it out, right? So that's the answer to that. And then did the U.S. advance across the Pacific by one axis or two? It was by two axes. They island hopped. They did not take every island. They used economy of force to only focus on the islands that were important. So they were island hopping, not taking every island. Then regarding Formosa, China, and the Philippines, where did the axes meet? So the axes met in the Philippines because they decided that taking the Philippines was something that was feasible, something that they could do and wouldn't cost them a lot. And they did not meet in Formosa, China, because Formosa, China would be like trying to eat the elephant whole, right? It would not lead to much victory. It would be very costly. So they figured it would be foolish for them to meet in Formosa, China, because the Chinese army was doing terribly. They wouldn't get much help, and it would have been, at best, a costly victory without gaining much at all. So they decided to meet in the Philippines, because that was two axes, two different commanders, island hopping along two different lines of islands, and they would eventually have to meet in one point together and take the Philippines together. Then, regarding China and key islands, in which were economy of force and mass applied. So along the key islands, they used economy of force, right? Because they were using minimal essential combat power, and that's how economy of force and mass was applied. Let's go back and read again what was important about economy of force and mass. So economy of force, maneuver, and mass. The U.S. applied minimal essential combat power in China to enable maneuver and application of decisive combat power at key islands at key times. So what's important to know here, what you should emphasize for the test, is that they used economy of force because they were applying minimal essential combat power in China, so that way they could maneuver better along the islands during island hopping, and they could spend most of their efforts on island hopping and focusing combat power at really important islands when it was needed.